Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Tuesday, 29 July, 2025. It is the 220th anniversary of the birth of Alexis Charles Henri Clérel, comte de Tocqueville, better known to posterity as Alexis de Tocqueville, who was born in Paris on this date in 1805. De Tocqueville is best known to posterity as the author of Democracy in America, which was published in two parts in 1835, in French, obviously, in the original, in 1835 and 1840, respectively. This was the result of his journey to America with his friend Gustave de Beaumont from May 1831 to February 1832. These 10 months of travel in America was the basis of Democracy in America. The pretext of the trip to America was to study the American prison system, and when the two returned, they dutifully made their report on American prisons. But really, the two of them wanted to study American society, and their trip to inspect American prisons was only a means to this end. But de Tocqueville wrote much more than just the one book that made him famous, and a good part of his writings have been translated into English. Back in France, de Tocqueville was in the thick of things, politically speaking, and this was a turbulent period to be in the thick of things in French political life. He was born when Napoleon was in power, lived through the June Rebellion of 1832, the July Monarchy, and the February Revolution of 1848. He didn't live to see the Paris Commune of 1871, but that was part of the same pattern of social and political instability in France after the Revolution. He was a member of the Chamber of Deputies for almost a decade, but was said to have hated the July Monarchy, in which Francois Guizot played a prominent role. I mentioned Guizot because, like de Tocqueville, he was an historian and a philosopher who was actively involved in 19th century French politics, but actively involved, one could say, on the other side from de Tocqueville. Douglas Johnson, in a book titled Guizot, Aspects of French History, 1787 to 1874, compared Guizot to de Tocqueville in this interesting passage. Quote, Tocqueville, by his attacks upon the alleged corruption of political life, was one of the chief critics of the Guizot administration. Where Guizot saw civic virtues and a sense of progress, Tocqueville saw timidity, dishonesty, egoism, and above all, mediocrity. Yet the essential difference between Guizot and Tocqueville is not to be found in any of these details. Guizot was a practical statesman whose political theory was aligned to the necessities of policy and government. Tocqueville was a prophet, and invariably a prophet of gloom. He saw many of the evils and possible dangers of the future, but he did little to combat them. Guizot was undoubtedly justified when he wrote to de Tocqueville in 1835 after the first volume of Democracy in America, "You judge democracy like an aristocrat who has been defeated, but who is convinced that his victorious opponent is right." Unquote. Guizot was a powerful figure in the July Monarchy, and when the Revolution of 1848 happened, some of the crowds shouted, "Down with Guizot." And the revolution that swept Guizot out of power, you could say, also swept de Tocqueville into power, and he played a prominent role in the revolutionary government, rising to the position of Minister of Foreign Affairs until he quit under duress, you could say, after the coup that brought Napoleon III and the Second Empire to power. He retired to his family home, the Chateau de Tocqueville, since he was from an old aristocratic family that had mostly come through the revolution, although he lost at least one great-grandfather to the guillotine. In his retirement from public life, he wrote further, in some ways building on the arguments he had introduced in Democracy in America. In his recollections, covering the period from 1848 to 1850, he recounts his years working with the revolutionary government to follow the revolution of 1848. He also wrote The Old Regime and the French Revolution, which is obviously about the French Revolution, or rather the period immediately prior to the French Revolution, attempting to assess the condition of French society on the eve of the Revolution. Also, his correspondence with Arthur de Gobineau has been published along with the unfinished fragments of the second volume on the French Revolution. And I highly recommend this correspondence with Gobineau, since it reveals the personality of both men more clearly, with each playing off the other in their letters. And despite their deep differences on questions of principle, they corresponded throughout a good portion of their lifetime. And this points to a facet of de Tocqueville's character, that he was willing to learn from those with whom he disagreed, like Guizot and Gobineau. De Tocqueville wasn't rigid or ideologically hidebound or dogmatic, and as a result, many different labels have been attached to de Tocqueville in the subsequent scholarship surrounding his work. Alan S. Kahan grouped de Tocqueville along with Burckhardt and John Stuart Mill as aristocratic liberals. Hugh Trevor Roper also compared him to Burckhardt, but grouped them with Lord Acton rather than Mill, saying, quote, Acton, by his social and intellectual character, belonged to that unfashionable elite of the 19th century, the aristocratic historical pessimists, an elite which included also such European thinkers as Alexis de Tocqueville and Jacob Burckhardt, unquote. De Tocqueville certainly was aristocratic, but was he pessimistic? Certainly there are many pessimistic passages in Democracy in America that suggest a pessimistic outlook for the future of America. But while de Tocqueville's ability to see the potential downside of revolutions that were kicked off, you could say, in the spirit of enthusiastic optimism could be called a kind of pessimism, it also could be called a tragic outlook on history. Hayden White said that de Tocqueville was, quote, both a liberal and a tragic realist, unquote. White included de Tocqueville as one of the four exemplars of 19th century historiography who imploded his history as tragedies, although White adds a caveat to tragic implotment. Quote, Tocqueville imploded American history not as any romantic ascent, or even as a tragic rise and fall in which the protagonist gains in consciousness by the suffering he endures. Democracy in its American form, which is to say, without any restraints upon its inherent impulses toward tyranny, could only come to a pathetic issue in the long run, unquote. Since de Tocqueville was one of the four historians that White used to formulate his argument about metahistory, he's discussed extensively in White's book, and it would be relatively easy to produce an episode on the metahistorical interpretation of de Tocqueville alone. I'm not going to do this, but I will quote one more passage from White since it touches on something that I find particularly interesting. Quote, in a historian such as Tocqueville, the particular attributes of a given institution, custom, law, art form, or the like, are less important as evidence than the species, class, and generic typifications which, on analysis, they can be shown to exemplify. And these typifications, in turn, are regarded by de Tocqueville as less important than the laws of social structure and process which govern the course of Western history, to whose operations they attest, unquote. What White is saying here, in his own idiom, is that de Tocqueville saw the function of institutions abstractly, and he saw the big picture of history within which these institutions are embedded. He's interested not in the individual institution, but in what the institution represents. And he's interested in what the institution represents because he's interested in the ultimate laws of history and society. France and America are mere counters in a great game for de Tocqueville. In this, I could compare him to his younger contemporary, Henry Thomas Buckle, who tried to formulate a science of history, though the result is theoretically quite different from what's implied in de Tocqueville. It would be an interesting exercise to compare and contrast de Tocqueville and Buckle, and maybe I'll take up that project at some point in time. I think Buckle had an authentic naturalistic outlook that's consistent with a scientific conception of history, while for de Tocqueville, nature is still the mere backdrop to human history, as we see in so often in his descriptions of wild nature in Democracy in America. This would be another interesting theme to follow up, but my thoughts aren't yet fully formed on this, so I'm going to leave it for another time. Like Buckle, de Tocqueville himself called for a new political science in the introductory chapter of Democracy in America. Quote, "The first duty which is at this time imposed upon those who direct our affairs is to educate the democracy, to warm its faith, if that be possible, to purify its morals, to direct its energies, to substitute a knowledge of business for its inexperience, and to acquaint with its true interests for its blind propensities, to adapt its government to time and place, and to modify it in compliance with the occurrence and the actors of the age. A new science of politics is indispensable to a new world. This, however, is what we think of least. Launched in the middle of a rapid stream, we obstinately fix our eyes on the ruins which may still be described upon the shore we have left, whilst the current sweeps us along and drives us backwards toward the Gulf." Unquote. But Democracy in America and his subsequent works as well don't really attempt to formulate the new science of politics that he believed to be necessary. Democracy in America is mostly descriptive and secondarily prophetic, and some of the descriptive passages are quite striking. De Tocqueville often writes of the American wilderness into which he saw European civilization penetrating, and he describes that wilderness almost with the eye of an ecologist. His two essays, 2 Weeks in the Wilderness and Excursion to Lake Oneida, are moving and poetic evocations of the wilderness in the New World. And there's another section in Volume 1, Part 2, Chapter 9, where he describes another journey across a lake in a canoe, very similar both descriptively and thematically to his essay, Excursion to Lake Oneida. In both of these, he not only beautifully describes nature, but also how rapidly the works of man return to nature, as in the case of the briefly inhabited homesteads now abandoned in the 2 island visits that de Tocqueville described. It would be tempting to read these passages symbolically, but whether they ought to symbolize the fate of Europe or the fate of America then becomes a problem. Since de Tocqueville himself employs the prophetic voice in many places in Democracy in America, the poetic descriptions easily suggest a symbolic interpretation. I would prefer to say, rather, that de Tocqueville's descriptions of the New World are description with a purpose. The melancholy note that de Tocqueville sounds when viewing abandoned homesteads returning to the condition of the wilderness introduces the prophetic tone that dominates the later chapters of the book. That is to say, it sets the mood without needing to be interpreted symbolically. The final chapters in particular are especially noteworthy for how they follow up on the somber and prophetic tone by detailing some of the problems that face American-style democracy. The 2 penultimate chapters, titled "What Sort of Despotism Democratic Nations Have to Fear," detail many of the dangers faced by American democracy, as de Tocqueville saw it, and this has exercised a particular fascination for those who see these dangers as foretelling a tragic flaw present from the beginning of American democracy that will eventually spell doom for the American project. The final chapter, titled "General Survey of the Subject," is, to my mind, even more compelling, since after having written a very long book, de Tocqueville summarizes all of it in a mere 4 pages. I can't think of any other author who has done us a comparable favor. It would be worth your time to read the final chapter first, and then to return to it periodically when reading the text from the beginning to keep yourself oriented within the framework of de Tocqueville's overview. I said earlier, following up on what Hayden White said of de Tocqueville, that he's not interested in the individual institutions, but in what that institution represents. And this in turn only to get at the overall historical process, how it functions, and where it's going. De Tocqueville is striving to get at the big picture, and this carries through to his other works after Democracy in America. He saw the great movement of Western civilization in his time to be the transition from the aristocratic societies of the past, still present in his time but declining, and the democratic societies of the future, already extant in nascent form in his time, but not yet fully formed and certainly not yet mature. For de Tocqueville, this great historical transition was unprecedented, and he often comments that the unprecedented events of his time have left him and us without guidance or understanding, as when he writes, quote, "As the past has ceased to throw its light upon the future, the mind of man wanders in obscurity," unquote. That quote is known from several different translations because it's been quoted frequently, and there are several translations of Democracy in America. So there are different wordings from it, but the same idea is present in all of them, that the past has ceased to illuminate the present and therefore gives us no guide to the future. We don't know where we're going, in other words. And without historical models to follow, we must look to the future, and that means we must look to where these unprecedented events first started to unfold. America and democracy in America has, for this reason, a prominent role to play in his understanding of history. De Tocqueville wanted to exhibit America as a kind of petri dish in which the new order that would come to rule the future was taking shape. America was on the cutting edge of the transition from the old aristocratic order to the new democratic order. But France was also a part of this historical transition. This comes across clearly in de Tocqueville's book on the French Revolution, in which he engages in an analysis of French society closely parallel to his earlier analysis of American society. And de Tocqueville was a reasonable man, not overly driven by ideological considerations, so he gives us an account of America and France within the context of the growth of what he sees as the democratic institutions in his time, and he gives us this account warts and all. That is to say, de Tocqueville doesn't try to sugarcoat his prediction for the coming age of mass democracy. De Tocqueville is almost painfully even-handed as he recounts both the virtues and the vices of American society, and both the promise and the dangers of the kind of democracy that Americans were attempting to put into practice. Both his account of America and France are tempered by restraint and an ability to always see the other side of a question and to see both sides as two sides of the same coin. American and French societies are different, and the eventual convergence on democracy will be different in each case because of their different histories. But both are part of the same overall movement of Western history away from aristocracy and its feudal institutions and toward democracy and its democratic institutions. When de Tocqueville's tragic or prophetic voice is emphasized, this even-handedness tends to be lost, since the even-handedness puts the prophecies of doom for democracy in their proper context alongside the promises of democracy, which are equally vividly present for de Tocqueville. This even-handedness, the temperateness of his exposition, and de Tocqueville's native rationalism all come into play in tempering his own ambitions. I quoted de Tocqueville earlier as saying that a new political science was needed in his time to explain and understand the great transition taking place from aristocracy to democracy. But de Tocqueville was no systematizer, and this probably goes a long way toward explaining why he didn't himself attempt the formulation of the science he prophesied and which Buckle attempted in his short life, which was even shorter than de Tocqueville's short life. In his recollections, de Tocqueville wrote, quote, "I detest these absolute systems which represent all the events of history as depending upon great first causes linked by the chain of fatality, and which, as it were, suppress men from the history of the human race. They seem narrow, to my mind, under the pretense of broadness and false beneath their air of mathematical exactness. I believe, following the writers who have invented these sublime theories in order to feed their vanity and facilitate their work, that many important historical facts can only be explained by accidental circumstances, and that many others remain totally inexplicable. Moreover, chance, or rather the tangle of secondary causes which we call chance, for want of the knowledge of how to unravel it, plays a great part in all that happens on the world's stage, unquote. Douglas Johnson, whom I quoted earlier on de Tocqueville's relationship to Guizot, while remaining highly critical of de Tocqueville and seeing Guizot's work as the more important contribution, also says that Guizot didn't possess de Tocqueville's vision or penetration. And perhaps this is what many are seeking when they read de Tocqueville, a distinctive vision and penetration into the heart of American democracy. But I think the vision and the penetration are two different things. I could call these the twin poles of democracy in America, the prophetic vision and the descriptive penetration. The vision is de Tocqueville's overview of Western history making a transition from aristocracy to democracy, playing out differently in France and America, to be sure, but playing out all the same. And this vision isn't confined to democracy in America, which is only a partial expression of de Tocqueville's historical vision. The penetration, on the other hand, is de Tocqueville's ability to describe elusive features of a complex and changing world. This power of penetration is revealed both in his book on America and his book on the French Revolution. And since I'm calling this a descriptive power, it's quite different in each case because French and American societies are quite different and different histories have to be described differently, or we're not describing what's distinctive and unique to each. This may sound like a pettifogging distinction to make, and it's not intended as a criticism that de Tocqueville's historical vision is a big picture vision of Western history, but the vision itself isn't especially penetrating. And de Tocqueville's penetrating descriptions of French and American society are fascinating, but it's not especially visionary. If de Tocqueville had managed to penetrate into the historical vision, or to envision the historical detail that he masterfully penetrated, he might have had made more progress toward the new political science that he prophesied in the opening pages of Democracy in America. Happy birthday, Alexis de Tocqueville, and thanks for listening.